Hello, I'm Keith Johnston, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Principal Analyst Audrey Chi Reed to discuss the potential of consumer backlash around generative AI. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you for having me, Keith. I'm really excited to be here today.
All right, so obviously GenAI is top of everybody's mind, but we're going to look at it from the lens of the consumer. Now, we were on top of this in late last year, early this year when we rolled out our predictions, and we said that consumer skepticism would be at an all-time high this year. And we're approaching the halfway mark and we're rolling right into election season. So talk about the prediction and why you thought everybody was going to be so skeptical in the first place.
Yeah, so with the backdrop of predictions, as you know, it's not just about trends, but what we think is going to happen this year. And there were a couple of big events that really drove the consumer predictions and what drove us to talk about this backdrop of heightened consumer skepticism. And that's really the elections around the world, primarily the US presidential elections and the Olympics. And interestingly, we knew AI was going to be a factor as part of that. But it wasn't really around until the amount of headlines around the accuracy of AI technology that really demonstrates how this skepticism is fed. So it's funny because if I were to really hone in on AI specifically and consumer skepticism around it, if 2023 skepticism around AI from consumers is all around the morality and ethics of AI, is it taking away our jobs? Is it taking away curiosity and intellect? The 2024 skepticism of AI is really around the output accuracy. One example, a very recent example, is Take Humane, a startup company that came out with an AI wearable device, which is like a little pin. It's a wearable device. It's an AI assistant, really. So the promise of the pin was that you can do all these things without being attached to a screen. Via voice commands or projecting it onto your hands, but it didn't really work. The same tech reviewers that got firsthand trial view of it and were optimistic about it are the same reviewers that are now giving it super negative reviews. And it's become kind of a joke in some ways in that community.
That's so interesting. So, the idea that in 2023, we're pretty optimistic. We're like, man, this technology is just so amazing. But then it starts to go so mainstream that now things are going wrong. We got skepticism, we have doubt, we have cynicism. I would have thought that would have been, a little bit more acute to a smaller population, but there's some really mass market mishaps going on with GenAI, right?
Yeah, there are. And, there's a range of them, right? For example, the Willy Wonka situation event in Scotland, if you remember it.
Yeah.
Where they created these very fantastical, great AI promises of what you can get at the event. And the event was such a sort of the Fire Festival 2.0 version of it. And then there's also the versions around, which I talk a little bit about as an example, is Under Armour. It's not just about what you make. Under Armour came out with an ad a few months ago now, I want to say, and they touted it as their first AI created ad. And the ad itself is nice. It's beautiful. It's a minute-long piece of really nice video advertisement. But the problem with it was that it took a lot of different pieces of video and advertisement and content from other directors and producers and didn't credit any of them. So we're sort of seeing a range of different types of AI and generative AI mishaps that are happening.
Yeah, but some of the examples that you're talking about, it's a shame that they're happening, but the impact has a limited range. What are we going to do come election time when deep fakes are rampant and just all the things that could happen with an election, or even influence on brands through that whole process with this technology? It's gonna get real for a consumer, right? Or a citizen, I guess is what I'm talking about too.
Yes, consumer and citizen. This is where it's really important for companies to not feel like it won't happen to them. I think there's always this it's not going to happen to me. It happens to big companies that spend a lot of money.
It's kind of like a data breach, right? You're like, oh man, they're not going to get at my computer. And then all of a sudden they show up.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think there's a little bit of we don't need to be proactive, or proactivity can wait for next year when we have a bigger budget, right? And that's just not the case right now. You don't know who's going to hurt you, and it can be a very, very small startup, and or it can be a very, very large company. It doesn't really matter who you are anymore. They're not discriminate on that. So the idea here is we've talked a little bit about making sure, especially coming up in an election year, especially around that Q2, Q3 timeframe, where Olympics kind of overlaps a little bit with the peak of the election cycle in the US at least, to start ramping up, making sure social listening is key. That you are listening to every facet of areas that your brand is happening in, that consumers might be talking about, where bad actors might start to form. That's kind of definitely one area to make sure you are on top of it. It shouldn't just be a tool that your digital team or your social media team is using. It should be something that you should be monitoring for your brand in general. The second area we talked about is making sure you actually have a reaction team to think about, that you're not just reacting when this arises, but that you have somebody cross-functional that you can lean in on creating a task force even to get to. Those don't really, that doesn't cost money, that
Right.
doesn't really cost, it's not, big in your budget. It's aligning and identifying the people, whether they are leaders, whether they are people who can execute, to actually help you react in real time if something like this happens to you.
So you start talking about the companies having these, these teams of folks to, make sure that, good data is good data, deepfakes are not, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm feeling like you're suggesting that everybody's got to become a little bit of an AI detective,
Yeah.
So, I mean, are we always going to have to play this little forensics game with AI? And if so, I mean, is there an easy test? So we're not overwhelmed by all this and not trusting anything that we see.
I don't know if there's an easy test, but I do think that there is definitely everybody's wearing a detective hat right now. It's not just companies, it's consumers too. If I looked at it from a consumer perspective, right? We see that I like using the example of, for example, KateGate, which is a few months ago, Kate Middleton, Princess of Wales. She, went away from the spotlight, said she had some medical issues, and then during Mother's Day in the UK, came out with this image of her and her three kids, and it was very obviously edited. People quickly pointed to it was AI. Something happened. It was an AI image. There was a lot of conversation around that. And then a week after, um, she came out with a video that talked about how she was undergoing cancer treatment. And even then, when this very, you would seem real confessional, and I would argue that many comments were very empathetic to the situation. There were still a lot of comments questioning the video, questioning whether it was AI created, questioning whether it was holograph. Hey, the trees and the leaves weren't kind of moving in the same way. Is this actually a real video? So even in those heightened moments where they are very real, authentic confessions, people are still questioning it, right? And we did a little sort of test in with our consumers within our online communities group, where we showed a bunch of images. Some of them were AI generated and some of them were real images. And we did a little test to see whether people could tell whether they were AI generated or not. And in general, there was no consensus. People were very confused. I think we used to have this perception that AI images were very real and fantastical and magical, but actually AI images now are very, very, very realistic, and you generally cannot tell anymore. So in general, I think there is this heightened skepticism, this distrust, where we are at first glance wondering whether it's real or not and questioning some of that. And I actually don't think that's a bad thing, by the way, Keith. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a healthy level of skepticism that people should have. We shouldn't just be going into things blind in general. We should be questioning things. We should be asking questions. And it's also going to, in that way, force companies and organizations and brands to be more transparent, to make sure that they're telling people what they're actually seeing and being very transparent with the process of how they're creating it. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think the skepticism is a healthy level of skepticism, but it makes the job harder. I'll put that out there.
What's so fascinating where you started this, I mean, this is a good conversation, and you're right. There should be a healthy level of skepticism, and, we should question a lot more things. But, what you're talking about started out with a photo of Kate. And the reality is that, there has been plenty of tools like Photoshop that could put that image together. But you needed probably a certain level of creativity, to get that done. But now AI, because you're just typing into a prompt, it's just gone mainstream. And, everything you're saying is true. But now we're all taking it a little bit more seriously because the tools are just too easy to use, right? Which then leads me, you recently, you published a blog pointing at where I'm going with this is that, the growth of generative AI, that consumers are starting to assume a posture of distrust. So everything we just talked about, like, yeah, it sounds logical, but do we have good data that is true, or are we projecting?
No, we've been at Forrester tracking consumer sentiment, perception, awareness, usage monthly now in the US and the UK since about a year ago now. And it's been really interesting to see these data points shift and trend in very consistent ways. So, for example, we look a lot about distrust, right? 77% of consumers in the US and UK, and this is from our March survey, think that companies should disclose when they are using generative AI when interacting with me. This number has, I would say, not fluctuated too much. It hasn't been seeing some big swings. It's actually been quite consistent in the past year. And more people would actually distrust information provided by generative AI than trust it. So we're seeing that number actually rise. We saw it rise quite a few percentage points in the last 3 months or so. And I do think that a lot of that is potentially reaction to some of these new technologies, these companies that are racing to put AI technology in everything that they do and not seeing it reap the benefits that they think they have because it isn't working the way that they want it to. Lastly, we're seeing that there's also not just trust in companies using it and how they're using it, but there's trust in themselves, in individuals, in the consumers themselves on whether they know how to use it correctly. So only 39% of people actually say and agree that they know how to use it responsibly and ethically. So there's this kind of interesting tension here, right? It's not just about companies, it's not just trust in companies, but it's trust in themselves on whether they are educated or aware or have the tools to know how to use it responsibly. So it's a two-way street here.
So those are questions that we're asking of, consumer, and they're answering. So certainly it's a valid response. But are there ways that they're actually currently showing distrust in AI? And perhaps specifically Gen AI, since, we've often been talking about these images that, hit the public mainstream.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in that the distrust comes in, I think, a little bit more behaviorally,
Mm.
right? It's not gonna, like you say, show up in this like very in the survey data specifically. But I point to a couple of behavioral thoughts here. One of them is the distrust comes in that there is going to be a large group of consumers who aren't going to be the first person to jump on the bandwagon. They're not going to be the first one to try new types of AI technologies because of what's happened in the past. So, one outcome, one behavior that we've seen in terms of brand repercussions when it's not done well isn't just reputation risk or brand damages, it's also consumers' resistance to change or innovation. When they've used it once, let's use ChatGPT, which is something that many, many people have used already. Um, if the prompt that they gave and the output that was given to them was not up to what they thought the answer might be or was not helpful, they might be less likely to use it again in the future. It might take them a little bit more time to get back into the swing of things and be comfortable with using it. And the same thing with businesses, right? If you sort of screw up once, um, consumers are less likely to want to support the new changes within your company. So Humane AI, again, I keep using that as an example because it's so recent. That's a good example of that, right? If they don't trust that your technology is going to work in the first place, how are they going to trust you again?
So true. We're talking about the consumer here, but, you know, what we're really talking about, the brands are tremendously at risk. They need to take responsibility of that output so that consumers can hopefully gain trust. I guess with all this Gen AI going on, what's really at stake for the brands and everything you're talking about it, can we get our arms around it, or is this just going to be the wild, wild west for a while?
I think it's going to be a little bit of a wild, wild west for now because what we're seeing here with brands specifically is that there was a race. There was like an AI race. I don't think anybody can deny that, right? Like it's in our smartphones, it's in every device, it's in every vendor that a company might be using is touting this new shiny object. Um, but the challenge here, and I say this a lot, generative AI is a vehicle. It's not the
Mm.
destination. It helps you be more productive. It helps you get things faster. It helps makes things simpler, less complex. It, makes it easier for me to draw a picture, and I suck at drawing pictures, right? And so there are things that it does, but I think ultimately it's a wild, wild west because people aren't thinking about it that way. They're thinking of generative AI as the destination, not the vehicle. And ultimately, and they're touting it as such, right? Look at all the branding. It's all AI, 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 but it's not actually telling you what it's doing or how it's solving a problem. It's sort of using this shiny object, this bandwagon for everybody to jump in on, but not actually talking about the unmet needs of a consumer or customer, um, or what job it's going to be doing. And I think that's really the problem here.
Yeah, and if you don't take charge of that, there's real reputation risk, damage to your brand. So, do you have advice on how brands should be communicating to their consumer that they're using generative AI or not, or will it
Yeah,
just be part of the fabric of creation and consumers won't care?
I think they're at least now, especially now. I don't want to say in 5 years' time when we kind of get it right, the technology's there, the output is great, like all of that. Maybe things will change in 5 years. But right now, when it's a little bit more precarious, everybody's experimenting. The breadth of what types of output you're getting largely differs, and varies. I think right now is a very, very important time for brands to be transparent about their process, about when they're using it, right? Example I can give is A24 production company just came out with a movie a few weeks ago, Civil War. I don't know if you've seen the trailer for it, but it's a futuristic movie, sort of an apocalyptic universe
Just
situation.
what we need right before an
Um,
election.
I know it's very timely. I think they did it on purpose, actually. But what was interesting was there were these like really awesome like movie posters that they created, that really drew the viewers in and was like very enticing and all that. But what they found was that all of these movie posters were all AI, generative AI created because none of the things that were shown in the posters actually showed up in the movie. So there's this disconnect between what you are advertising and what you're actually giving the experience to consumers, right? That there's a disconnect. And, there wasn't really any transparency with from the production company about this. It was sort of like, wait, I saw this and it didn't even show up in the movie. Like, what are you hawking? What are you actually advertising? So it's definitely more important than ever. And I think a couple of things that we talk about, and we go back to very foundational things that I want to share that I think is really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about this and go a bit more in depth in this in our CX North America forum, in our summit, in the track session. But I talk about it in sort of the four P's because at Forrester we love our frameworks and our alliteration here. But a couple of like very foundational things is an analyst before me, Anjali Lai, she created this algorithm of authenticity piece, which I love. So the idea of how do you actually measure authenticity and how do you actually define it versus making it very fluffy. So that's really a really important brand foundational piece of understanding what that means, within the essence of why you're using AI and why you're using generative AI. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The other part is another analyst of ours, Jay Patasol. He wrote a lot about intelligent creativity as a process, as an implementation tool. So, intelligent creativity as a tactic of how you think about bringing in intentionally ways of data and AI and all those pieces of technology in with humans and how you can work together to create a very strong process in creating, great advertising or marketing pieces. Then there's, I would say, the more tactical piece, right? The human element, the people piece. You have to have human insight, oversight. We talk a lot about setting up governance, especially if you're in the US where there currently isn't any federal AI regulation set up. Everyone is just self-policing. We're in this like self-policing state right now, or they're not policing at all. So this is very dangerous because the outcome can be very inconsistent in policies. Um, and people act dangerously because of that. And lastly, I talk a lot about partnership, right? Partners. That's where execution happens a lot, and that's where things oftentimes fail. So, vetting your partners, which can range from vendors to influencers to organizations, these are the people oftentimes executing your brand or executing the work for you. And that's where things go wrong if there aren't policies in place or the right contractual language or the right agreements in place. So that's really where my thought is in terms of just giving the recommendation for brands to get deeper on balancing that innovation, with risk.
So balancing innovation with risk, after you discussed that, there should be more federal regulation. That seems at odds, in particular with this technology. I just think that it's so rampant, and the machines keep learning from themselves, and innovation. I mean, the level of investment that is going on right now. Do you really think that we can actually police what you're talking about, which is this wide scale measure of authenticity?
Interesting. I don't know if it's about policing, but I do think that what regulations can give, and again, it depends on, to your point, the depth of the regulations, but it does start giving companies and brands a set of framework and a set of guidelines to work across, which then leads to a little bit more consistency across the board. And that's where potentially less mishaps will happen, right? Because if you have a set of foundational guidelines to adhere to, a group to go to for questions, there is going to end up being more consistency and potentially less bad actors in place. The authenticity piece, I don't actually really think that's at odds with this in many ways, because the authenticity piece is very much brand driven and what the brand believes in and their credibility and their ability to understand who they are from a brand perspective. And it's really understanding how AI or generative AI plays into that and plays a role in that. So I don't actually really think it's at odds with each other. I think they're two separate things in many ways.
But I like to challenge that a little bit because, where I'm going is that consumers have to rely on a very big system that influences how they're communicated to, the advertising they consume, the media that they consume. And I think what often we don't talk about, and I don't think consumers know, is that how big this system is that Gen AI is infiltrating in advertising. Let me just focus on advertising because it's a little easier. What you're talking about is that the brands themselves have to be careful. The AI, Gen AI, all the AI that they're going to use, they have to ask a lot of their partners to regulate it. Their partners have to ask a lot of the technology players and innovators that are ingesting the training data and giving those partners the tools. The media folks out there where we buy our media, and they've been using AI for a long, long time. We have to trust them. This just seems like such a big system at which the consumer will have to rely on the authenticity of what they're seeing.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. And with the vast network of the different players that come into place, there is always going to be a breakdown of communication and a breakdown of challenges, right? So I think from the consumer perspective, we are definitely going to see general trust placed, because if you think about it, terms and conditions, who reads that anymore, right?
No.
Nobody actually reads that.
And they're changed every week.
And they're changed every week, and you get an email, yeah, and it's left unread in my inbox. But I think there is going to be a blanket trust in the process, a blanket trust. If a company says they're doing it, I'm going to probably trust that they've done some work behind it. I'm not a type of consumer that will dig into it very deeply, but I am going to trust that you might have done something about it. Therefore, I do think it's important for some policies and regulations to be put in place to hold those companies accountable for doing that work. If you say you're going to do it, I want to know that you've done some extent to it. So I do think there's a little bit of accountability in the sense here for companies to do it, and to put that work and responsibility on them. It's not going to be perfect, but little steps and little policies will get us to a more responsible future.
Awesome. Well, now that we left everyone with this very daunting puzzle that you're going to solve for us, Audrey, you'll talk more about it at CX North America, but I just feel like this is going to be a long journey. Is there more research that you're going to be doing that's going to help both our clients and, as we continue to discuss this topic and podcast, our listeners out there?
Yeah, so we have some exciting research that will be upcoming, specifically around trust and AI. We're this year revamping our trust data a little bit, so we'll be able to correlate a lot of understanding around consumer trust and AI. So there will be some really interesting data points that we're seeing and getting back soon. As it relates to the CX North America conference, I will be sharing this track there. It's going to be on the first day, Don't Get Canceled, Overcoming Generative AI Consumer Backlash is the title. I'll also be talking about it a little bit broadly on the keynote that I'll be doing from a consumer perspective on the first day as well.
And that one's fascinating, right? You're talking about how the AI
Yep.
or the AI version of us may become a factor in all this.
Yep. What will happen when it's not just the human you, but the AI you as well, and what that happens to, how will that empower consumers ultimately or not? So that'll be a really fun keynote that I'm really excited to share. But in regards to research, there's a lot of trust and consumer research that will be coming out in the latter half of the year that I'm really excited to share with the public and with our clients.
All right, very exciting. Thank you so much, Audrey, for sharing your perspective on this topic. Like I said, there is just so much more to come. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
If you like what you heard today, be sure to check out the agendas for our upcoming CX Summit events in Nashville, London, and Sydney. To learn more, visit for.com/CX events. That's FORR.com/CX events. Thanks for listening.